The night my mother told me I was on my own, I was still wearing a hospital bracelet. I had just been discharged after 3 days in the ICU. My left wrist was wrapped in a soft cast. 2 of my ribs were cracked. And my 7-week-old daughter, Piper, was sleeping in a car seat that the nurses had helped me buckle because my hands were still shaking too much to do it myself. The doctor had asked me, twice, if I had someone coming to pick me up. I told him yes both times. That was a lie. My husband Vincent had called that morning, not to ask how I was feeling, not to say he was on his way. He called to tell me that his mother who lived 40 minutes away in a 4-bedroom house with 2 empty guest rooms, had decided it wasn't a good time for house guests. I remember sitting on the edge of the hospital bed, still in the thin gown they'd given me, listening to him explain this to me like it was a weather update, like it was just information I needed to process and move on from. "She's been under a lot of stress," he said. I didn't say anything. What was there to say? My own parents lived 12 minutes from that hospital. 12 minutes. I know because I'd driven that route hundreds of times since I was 16, and got my license. I called down my mother from the hospital room while the nurse was printing my discharge papers. She picked up on the second ring. She was never not near her phone. "Mom," I said, "I need you to come get me. I'm being discharged." There was a pause. Not a long one, but long enough. "Honey," she said, "your father and I talked about it and we don't think we're in a position to take on a baby right now. You know how your father's back has been. And I've got my book club on Thursday, and the garden club on Saturday, and I just can't have that kind of disruption." I stopped listening somewhere around book club. I want to be clear about something. Piper was not a difficult baby. She wasn't colicky. She slept in 2 to 3 hour stretches. She didn't scream. She was 7 weeks old, and she was perfect, and she needed a place to sleep that wasn't a car, and her grandmother, my mother, was telling me she couldn't help because she had a garden club meeting on Saturday. I sat in that hospital lobby for almost an hour. Piper in the car seat at my feet. I had $43 in my checking account because Vincent controlled the finances and had temporarily moved things around while I was on maternity leave, which I'd agreed to because I trusted him. I had no cash. I had a cracked phone screen, and I had no idea what I was going to do. That's when my phone rang. The name on the screen was Uncle Clifton. I almost didn't answer. We weren't close, not really. My mother's older brother. He lived about 2 hours away, out past the county line, on a property that my grandmother had left him when she passed 5 years ago. I'd been to his house maybe 4 times in my life. He was quiet, private, the kind of man who showed up at family events, stayed 2 hours, and drove home without fanfare. My mother had always described him as odd. What she meant was that he didn't do things the way she thought they should be done. I answered. "Felicity," he said, no preamble. "I heard what happened. Are you still at the hospital?" I said. "I'm in the lobby. Stay there, I'm already on my way." He hung up before I could ask how he knew. Clifton arrived in a gray pickup truck that had seen better decades. He was 61 years old tall, with gray at his temples and work-calloused hands. He walked into that hospital lobby like he owned it, spotted me across the room, and crossed to me without hesitating. He looked at Piper. He looked at me. He picked up the diaper bag from the floor, slung it over his shoulder and said, "Come on, let's get you out of here." He didn't ask me what happened on the drive. He put on the radio, old gospel, low volume, and drove. Piper fell asleep within 10 minutes. I leaned my head against the window and watched the road and tried not to cry, and then I cried anyway, and he didn't say a word about it. Just reached over and turned the gospel up a little, like that was answer enough. His house was a white farmhouse on 8 acres. There was a vegetable garden out back, a covered porch with 2 wooden rocking chairs, and a room at the end of the hall that he had already made up with fresh sheets. There was a small bassinet in the corner. I stopped in the doorway. "Where did you get that?" I asked. "Bought it last week," he said. "After your mother called to tell me she wasn't going to help you." He said it so plainly, like it was just a fact, like he'd heard that information, processed it, and handled it. "She called you?" I said. "She called to tell me so I wouldn't get involved." He set the diaper bag on the dresser. "She knows me well enough to know I'd get involved." I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. I just stood in that doorway with my cracked ribs and my hospital bracelet and my baby daughter, and I thought, this man I barely know just bought a bassinet for my daughter before I even asked him for help. And my mother couldn't cancel garden club. The first week I slept. Clifton handled things I didn't know he knew how to handle. He warmed bottles. He walked Piper at 3 in the morning when she fussed. He made actual meals, real food, not just toast and peanut butter, and put them in the fridge with little notes that said things like, Eat this before 9 p.m. and don't forget to drink water. He drove me to my follow-up appointments. He carried Piper's car seat like he'd been doing it his whole life. I started sleeping more than I had since before Piper was born. But here's the thing about having time to rest. When you stop running, everything you've been running from catches up with you. I started thinking about the accident. It had happened on a Tuesday morning, 7 weeks after Piper was born. I was driving to the pediatrician for Piper's 6-week checkup. Piper was in the back seat. I was going 43 miles per hour on a road I'd driven 100 times. And then my brakes just stopped. I pumped them. Nothing. I turned hard into a curb to slow down and clipped a light pole. The airbag deployed. I remember thinking, very clearly, just before impact, something is wrong with this car. The car was a 2019 sedan, Vincent's family car, registered in both our names. He'd had it in his possession for the 2 weeks I was recovering from a postpartum infection. I'd been staying at my sister's place because our apartment was being repainted. When I came back, he handed me the keys and said the car was all cleaned up. I'd thought that was sweet at the time. At Clifton's house, lying in the dark at 2 in the morning, while Piper slept in her bassinet, I kept coming back to that. He had the car for 2 weeks. And then the brakes failed. I told myself I was being paranoid. Trauma does things to your thinking. Postpartum hormones do things to your thinking. I told myself the accident was a mechanical failure, a coincidence, something that happens to people. But I couldn't let it go. On a Thursday afternoon, while Piper napped, I sat at Clifton's kitchen table with my cracked phone and started going through things I hadn't let myself look at yet. I opened the banking app. Vincent had always managed our money. He'd set it up that way from the beginning, had his own system, said it was simpler if one person handled it. I'd trusted that. I'd also trusted that when he said things were tight since Piper was born, that was just the honest truth of having a new baby. What I found in that banking app was not tight. There were transfers I didn't recognize, regular ones going out every 2 weeks to an account I didn't have the details for. Significant amounts, 300 here, 500 there. One for 1,200 that went out 3 days after Piper was born, when I was still in the hospital. The account had a reference code I didn't recognize, but the timing, every 2 weeks like clockwork, for the past 8 months, made my stomach turn. I sat there for a long time. Then I heard Clifton's truck pull into the gravel drive, and I closed the app and I didn't say anything. That night, after dinner, Clifton sat across from me at the kitchen table, with 2 mugs of decaf, and said, "You've been quiet all afternoon. What did you find?" I told him I didn't know what he meant. He gave me a look, the kind that doesn't need words. I told him what I'd found. He listened the whole time without saying anything. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you know about your husband's business?" "He's in commercial real estate," I said. "He has a business partner. A guy named actually, I've never met him. I just know his name. Whitfield. Vincent's mentioned him maybe a dozen times in 4 years. Clifton nodded, slowly, like he was filing that away. "What aren't you saying?" I asked. "I'm not saying anything yet," he said. "Because I don't know enough yet." "Uncle Clifton, Felicity." He looked at me across the table. "You were in a car accident where your brakes failed. You have a 7-week-old baby. Your husband has been moving money out of your joint account on a regular schedule to an account you can't identify. And your mother called me before you were even discharged from the hospital to tell me not to get involved." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "That's a lot of things to be coincidences." I hadn't told him about my mother calling before I was discharged. I'd said she called me to say she wasn't coming. I hadn't mentioned the timing. "How do you know she called before I was discharged?" I asked. He was quiet for a second. Then, he said, "Because she called me the same night as the accident. Before we even knew how bad it was, she called to tell me not to come." The room felt like it tilted slightly. "She called you the night of the accident," I said. "The night of," he said. "Before we knew if you were going to be okay." I put my mug down very carefully. "Why would she do that?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in the dark and went through every conversation I could remember having with my mother in the past year, looking for the thing I'd missed, the thing I'd explained away, or laughed off, or filed under, Mom being dramatic. There were more of those than I wanted to admit. 6 months ago, she'd asked me, casually over Sunday brunch, whether my grandmother's trust had been settled yet. My grandmother on my father's side had passed when I was pregnant. She'd left me a significant sum, not life-changing money, but real money. Enough to put a down payment on a house, enough to matter. I'd told my mother it was still in probate. She'd nodded and changed the subject. I hadn't thought anything of it. 4 months ago, Vincent had brought home paperwork. Said it was something to do with our joint finances, a restructuring thing, some legal housekeeping. I'd been 36 weeks pregnant and exhausted, and I'd signed where he pointed and gone back to the couch. I hadn't read it. The thought hit me like cold water. I called my grandmother's estate attorney the next morning. Her name was Ms. Tran, and she was meticulous and no nonsense, and I'd always liked her. I got her voicemail. I left a message saying I needed to review the documentation on my grandmother's trust, and could she call me back when she had a chance. She called me back in 40 minutes. What she told me, carefully, professionally, like she was handing me a live wire, was that approximately 3 months ago, a transfer request had been submitted for the funds from my grandmother's trust. The request bore my signature. It had been processed. The funds had been redirected to a holding account she wasn't able to identify. I sat in Clifton's bedroom with Piper asleep in the bassinet and my phone pressed to my ear, and I couldn't breathe. "Miss Tran," I said very carefully, "I didn't submit that request." A pause. "Then, I was hoping you'd say that." Clifton drove me to a lawyer's office 2 days later. Not a family friend, not someone my parents knew. An attorney he'd found himself, a woman named Mrs. O.C. who specialized in financial fraud and family law, and who had an office that smelled like good coffee and looked like she had never lost a case in her life. I liked her immediately. I laid everything out: the accident, the brake failure, the bank transfers, the paperwork I'd signed at 36 weeks pregnant without reading it, the trust funds that had been redirected, my mother's phone call to Clifton the night of the accident. Mrs. O.C. listened with a legal pad in front of her and a very still face. When I finished, she said, "Tell me about your husband's business partner." "His name is Whitfield," I said. "I've never met him. Vincent's mentioned him periodically over the years, but I never had reason to." "Do you know his first name?" "No." She wrote something on her pad. "I'd like you to give me access to the banking records, the trust documentation, and anything else you can pull together. I'm also going to want to talk to the mechanic who examined your car after the accident. The insurance company handled that," I said. "I know," she said. "I'd still like to talk to him." Clifton drove me home. We didn't talk much. I held Piper the whole way back, her warm weight against my chest, and I thought about the paperwork I'd signed at 36 weeks pregnant and the word that kept surfacing in my mind, the word I hadn't let myself say out loud yet: deliberate. Mrs. O.C. worked fast. Within a week, she had pulled the documentation on the trust transfer and submitted it for forensic review. Within 10 days, she had identified the holding account the funds had been transferred to. It was registered to a limited liability company. The LLC had 2 members. One was a man named Whitfield Arno. The other was Vincent. When she called to tell me this, I was standing in Clifton's kitchen. I remember the afternoon light was coming through the window over the sink, hitting the yellow curtains, and it looked so ordinary, so still. The kind of afternoon that has no idea what it's containing. "There's more," Mrs. O.C. said. "The LLC was formed 14 months ago, while you were pregnant." 14 months ago. Piper was 7 months old now, which meant they'd started planning this before she was born. "The bank transfers from your joint account," she continued. "They were going to the same LLC. We're working to determine whether the transfer of your grandmother's trust funds was fraudulent, which I believe it was. I'm also waiting on a report from the automotive forensics examiner I brought in to review what remains of the accident documentation." I leaned against Clifton's kitchen counter and closed my eyes. "What do you think he'll find?" I said. "I think," she said carefully, "that the brake line failure in your vehicle was not accidental." I had already known that. I had known it for 2 weeks, lying in the dark with Piper in her bassinet. But hearing someone else say it was different, hearing it said plainly, professionally, in a voice that didn't waver, that was different. "And my mother?" I said. A pause. "Your mother signed a document as a witness to the trust transfer." I opened my eyes. The yellow curtains were still there, still catching the light. "She witnessed the signature that wasn't mine," I said. "Yes." I thanked her and ended the call and stood in Clifton's kitchen for a long time. Then I went to the back door and stood on the porch in the cold and breathed in the outside air until I felt like I could move again. Clifton came and stood next to me. He didn't touch me. Didn't say anything, just stood there. That was enough. The next few weeks were a combination of the most terrifying and most clarifying of my life. Mrs. O.C. filed a police report on my behalf regarding the suspected brake tampering and the fraudulent transfer of my grandmother's trust funds. A detective was assigned. He was a thorough man who asked good questions and never seemed to be in a hurry. Twice he came to Clifton's house to speak with me. The second time, he told me they had identified surveillance footage from a parking garage near our apartment building that showed Vincent's car in a lower level the evening before my accident, with him in it, and Whitfield Arno. Vincent was arrested on a Tuesday. Whitfield Arno was arrested the same day. The charges included conspiracy, attempted murder, wire fraud, and theft by deception. The financial crimes alone, the theft from the LLC, the fraudulent trust transfer, were being investigated by a separate unit. My mother was not arrested, but she was interviewed, and the interview did not go well for her. She had signed as a witness on the trust transfer documents, which meant she had known what was happening, had watched me be defrauded of my own grandmother's legacy, and had said nothing. Had, in fact, called Clifton the night of the accident to tell him not to get involved. I didn't speak to her. I had nothing to say. My father called me once. He said, "You have to understand, your mother was in a very difficult position." I said, "Dad, do not call me again until you're ready to tell me that what happened was wrong." He didn't call again. Piper turned 3 months old on a Thursday. Clifton made a cake, from scratch, yellow cake with cream cheese frosting, because he said every occasion deserved a real cake. He put 3 candles on it, 1 for each month. We ate it at the kitchen table with the late afternoon light coming through the window. Piper sat in her little bouncer next to my chair and waved her hands at nothing in particular, which she had recently started doing, and which I found unreasonably delightful every time. I looked at my uncle across the kitchen table, the man who had driven 2 hours without being asked, who had bought a bassinet before I arrived, who had made me eat real food and drink water and sleep, who had sat with me on a cold porch and said nothing and meant everything. And I thought, some people just know what family is. They don't perform it and they don't announce it. They just show up. I'm going to find a place of my own, I told him. Soon. When everything settles down a little more. I know, he said. But I want you to know that what you did. I stopped. Started again. I don't have words for it. You don't need them, he said. He pushed my piece of cake closer to me. Eat your cake. The forensic accountants finished their work in late spring. The total amount that had been diverted from my joint accounts and stolen from my grandmother's trust was significant. Enough that when Mrs. O.C. walked me through the numbers, I had to ask her to repeat them twice. The funds had been funneled through the LLC into investments that Vincent and Whitfield had planned to liquidate. They had timed it for when I was deepest into new motherhood, when I was most distracted, most exhausted, most likely to sign something without reading it. They had planned to use my grandmother's money she had earned and saved and left specifically for me, to fund their own real estate scheme. And when I'd started asking questions, when I'd accidentally let slip to Vincent one evening that I'd tried to log into the estate attorney's portal and gotten locked out, they decided the fastest solution was to remove me from the equation entirely. Mrs. O.C. told me this without flinching. I did not flinch either. The civil case was straightforward, she told me. The estate attorney's records and the forensic accounting made the fraud clear. The funds from the trust would be returned. The joint accounts would be settled through divorce proceedings. The criminal case, the attempted murder charge, was proceeding, and the DA's office was confident. I thanked her. I buckled Piper into her car seat. I drove back to Clifton's house through the spring afternoon, the windows down, Piper asleep in the back. I thought about the woman I'd been 8 months ago, signing documents I didn't read at 36 weeks pregnant, because I trusted the person handing them to me. I thought about the hospital lobby, and the $43 in my account, and my mother saying the word disruption. I thought about Clifton's truck pulling into the parking lot and the bassinet already set up in the guest room. I thought about what it means to actually know someone. I found an apartment in June, a 2-bedroom, first floor, with a small yard in the back that I thought Piper might enjoy once she could walk. Clifton came with me to look at it. He stood in the kitchen and checked that the faucets worked and asked the landlord about the heating system and negotiated a small reduction in the security deposit in a way that was so calm and matter-of-fact that the landlord barely knew it had happened. On the day I moved in, Clifton brought a rocking chair, the same kind as the ones on his porch. He put it in the corner of Piper's room and said, "Every kid's room needs one of those." I wanted to tell him he didn't have to do that. But the truth was, I'd stopped trying to talk him out of taking care of us. It wasn't a burden for him. It was just what he did. It was who he was. Piper slept in that room on her first night in our apartment. I sat in the rocking chair in the dark and listened to her breathe and felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly. Not yet. Something quieter than that. Something more like, I know where I am. I know who is with me. I know we are safe. That's enough to start with. My mother has not called. I have not reached out. I don't know if there will ever be a conversation that sets things right between us, or if right is even something that applies anymore. Some things, once you've seen them clearly, you cannot unsee. She watched her brother's money get stolen from me. She was there when they forged my name. She called Clifton the night I was in the ICU to make sure he stayed away. I don't hate her, but I understand now that love is not the same as safety. And I spent too many years mistaking one for the other. Vincent is awaiting trial. His attorney has asked for continuances twice. I don't know what the outcome will be, and I've tried to make peace with not knowing, because spending my energy waiting on that verdict is energy I could be spending on Piper. On the apartment with the small yard, on getting back to work, which I did in August, part-time at first, then full schedule by October, on calling Clifton on Sunday evenings and talking for an hour about nothing in particular, which has somehow become the best part of my week. What I know is this. The people who were supposed to protect me decided I was worth less than what they could take from me. And the person who had no obligation to do anything drove 2 hours and set up a bassinet and made me eat real food and stood on a cold porch without saying a word, because that was enough. Piper is almost a year old now. She pulls herself up on the coffee table and grins at me over the edge with 4 teeth and an expression that looks honestly and terrifyingly like she already knows things. She laughs when Clifton holds her. She reaches for him when he walks into the room. There are people you are born to, and then there are people who choose you, quietly and without ceremony, right when you need it most. I know which one matters more.